I think one of the hardest things that we have to do as parents is not losing our shit when our kids are losing their shit. It's the hardest thing in the world to do. And this rings true for anything in life. Anytime we are confronted with something emotional, our first reaction is emotions, because just like our kids, we also have an amygdala, and we also jump into this fight, flight, and freeze mode, except as adults, we're a little stronger and have a little more confidence. So for us, we jump into fight mode probably quicker than our kids do. The last thing I want to do is come on these walk and talks and act like I'm perfect, like I'm this perfect parent or this perfect principal or this perfect teacher, because I'm far from it. 3 or 4 weeks ago, I ran into this as a parent. My daughter tore some ligaments in her ankle, and life is hard for her right now because she's not been able to play the sport that she loves. She still goes to practices, she still goes to games, and I'm really proud of her for that, for staying committed to her team. She hasn't been able to drive, so she can't get around like she used to, having to go back to depending on her parents. And anyway, she was having a moment, and it got a little heated, and without thinking, I lost my shit. I stormed up the stairs, yelled at her, banged on her door, told her to cut that shit out. And of course, what did it do? It escalated the situation. And, within seconds, I was like, oh God, Leroy, you talk about this stuff all the time. And here you are, reacting emotionally, jumping into fight mode, not letting your prefrontal cortex be in charge. And the reason why I got there is because I was exhausted. I was tired. As parents, as adults, we carry a lot. We carry the bills. We carry, and especially nowadays, it seems like you go get a bag of groceries and it costs you $85 and you come back with a carton of eggs and some milk, and if you're lucky, some prosciutto. Thankfully for me, I like to eat a lot of pasta, so my bills are a little bit cheaper. But, we have all of these things that make it harder for us. In that week leading up to my reaction to Evie, it was just one of those weeks. I had a lot of parent phone calls. Teachers were struggling. There was a lot of people sick, so we were short-staffed. The weather was crappy. Kids just came back from spring break, so they were more irritable. And as a principal, you have to wear all that, right? As a principal, your job is to sort of be the puppet master, and you have to help people manage their emotions and bring them back into that realm of emotional intelligence so they can put their best foot forward. And I just had a week, right? And I let it catch up with me. It ended up having to end that week and taking Evie to a volleyball tournament, and which is, that was hard too, because here I am used to seeing my daughter out there just smashing it and ripping it, and you can see her sitting on the bench, just sad, heartbroken that she can't be out there, and hurts the heart. So, as parents, we show up with that sometimes, and that's what I want to talk about today. This Saturday's Walk and Talk is about what we bring to the table emotionally, and how our emotions that we bring to the table can escalate a situation. So let's look at this in the context of science, right? Here I am, a 52-year-old man. I get on here every second Saturday, and I'm doing my best to educate parents on how to raise their kids. And I hope I don't come across as somebody who doesn't make mistakes, because I do make mistakes. I make mistakes in my job when it comes to working with adults, and I make mistakes with kids. I make mistakes with parents. But I do my best to own my shit. If I do make a mistake, I'm the first to apologize. And the great Cal Day used to tell me, crow tastes good if you throw a little salt on it, and he wasn't wrong, right? And of course, we want to model that for our kids. If we make mistakes, we want to own it. It's like the video I talked about last week. Our goal is to regulate, reflect, and repair. And a lot of that repairing, when we respond emotionally, revolves around saying sorry and making amends for some of the shitty things we say or the things we do to people, right? So I try to lead by example in that regard. We have an amygdala, we have a prefrontal cortex, and our prefrontal cortex is pretty much fully developed by the time we're 25 years old, I think, roughly around 25, 26 years old. I'm sure there's a brain scientist out there who could correct me or give you the actual age that it's developed. But at the end of the day, we are also influenced by environmental factors. We're influenced by, if we've had a good sleep, if we've eaten properly, if we're getting any exercise, our relationships with our kids, with our significant others, with our colleagues at work, and all that stuff affects us emotionally. And as a result, our amygdala engages just as much as the next person does, just as much as a kid's does. The difference is that we do know better. If we took 20 to 30 seconds a minute and just stopped and took some deep breaths, all of us adults could stop and go, okay, I'm acting a little bit crazy right now. I need to just take a chill pill and take a step back from this situation. But sometimes we don't, because sometimes as adults, especially if you like the drama, we dive deeper into it. We go and vent to somebody else, and then somebody else takes your side because they got your back, and next thing you know, a molehill is a mountain. Which leads me into the next part about this walk and talk. And this is very important, and it's something that I talk a lot about when I do workshops with schools and I'm working with educators, EAs, teachers, principals. And it's crucial. It's our ego. And when I talk about ego, I'm not talking about ego in the sense of somebody being arrogant or narcissistic. Those really, it's the place it's the place we go to when we say somebody has an ego. We go to a negative place about who they are, right? And the fact is that our ego is something that starts to develop when we're 7, 8 years old, and our ego is what helps us manage how we react in situations. The reason why I bring up ego for us, because this walk and talk is for adults, for parents, teachers, whoever watching this, because for us, ego is like our protection. It's our shield. If people have an underactive ego, they have a lower self-esteem, they're too afraid to take people on, to stand up for themselves, and life becomes more difficult. And then you have people who have overactive egos, who get a little too protective and are a little too confident at times. And, they also can cause some angst for the people they're interacting with. So ultimately what we want is we want to have this balanced ego, right? And what happens when we're confronted with emotions from our kids or from colleagues or from work is our ego comes in and it goes into protection mode. And the moment our ego goes into protection mode, we start getting into that place where we do get overconfident. And then when our ego steps in, that's when we jump into that place where we're going to be protective. Rather than, you're going to jump to a place where you get defensive. Rather than listen, you're going to be reactive, because you do not want to leave and you feel justified in your response because of how you're feeling. And when our ego becomes overactive and it starts to kick in, we start to justify our fatigue, our stress, our reactions, because our ego gives us permission to do that. And unfortunately, it's a skewed representative of what actually is happening. In the video before this, when I was talking about lying, I talked about a kid's perspective. And, it's the same thing as adults. A lot of times when we're in a situation, because we're emotional and our ego steps up, our perspective is going to feel accurate in the moment. And it's not going to be until you walk away and you're calm when you realize, like, holy man, I was in the wrong there. When you take time to regulate and you reflect. And so that's what makes it hard, is when your ego is overactive because of the emotions, we tend to get very defensive. And being defensive doesn't lead to great collaboration or communication, and things start to fall apart at that point. I see this oftentimes with parents when their kid comes home with an issue, and right away they're on the phone. They're upset because their kid is upset, and and there's nothing wrong with being upset if you feel like your kid has been harmed in any way, but right away you're listening to your kid's perspective, which is emotional, and then you jump into that fight, flight, and freeze mode, which is typically fight, because again, nobody's going to get in between a mama bear and her cub. That's where communication fails, and that's where collaboration starts to disappear. and then you can't be rational, right? And you start having these irrational thoughts and irrational conversations. You start creating stories in your head. You start going back to when you went to school and how a teacher treated you. You know, it's the same thing if you have a situation with a significant other or a colleague at work. We're triggered. When we get triggered by our baggage, our amygdala fires up. And next thing you know, our prefrontal cortex is offline. Our ego steps in and we're in a battle. You know, when you're in that place where your kids' emotions are elevating and you can feel yours elevating, we need to do the exact same thing that we teach our kids, right? We need to take those deep breaths. This is not just a kid thing, because when we take those deep breaths, those deep diaphragmatic breaths, that soothes that polyvagal nerve, which is connected right to our toes, our fingertips. It's how we feel cold. It's how we feel emotion. It's how we feel a rock on our foot or a blade of grass on our feet, the wind in our hair. We feel everything. And that polyvagal nerve is what sends messages to our brain. And so the first thing we have to realize is that as soon as our kids are emotional, we got to go, okay, kid's emotional. I need to know it's coming for me too. So I need to stop, take a deep breath, and I need to regulate. It's a matter of getting to that place where you recognize it's getting emotional and let it pass. And it's more about taking a step back, realizing you have an emotional kid in front of you or another person who's an emotional, give it a chance to rest and come back and have a conversation. It's like for me at work, a lot of my communication is through email. Sometimes I leave an email to the next day, because if I react in the moment, I'm going to react with my amygdala. I'm going to react with my, you know, it's like, how dare you? I've been in education for 26 years there, Miss Jones. I know more about raising kids than you can imagine. I've got this many degrees, blah, blah, blah. And so that's all ego, right? Even though I do have an expertise and a knowledge, it doesn't mean that I have all the information and am right all the time. You know, and so that's why you need to take some steps back and separate. And so when you're dealing with your kids, especially when they're losing it, that's where we have to make sure in all of this stuff that I teach you guys, that we also have to get our breathing in check, so that way our prefrontal cortex can jump in. Because as adults, we look really irrational and crazy when we lose it. You know, we kind of lose the ability to just be an angry kid when we get past 25 years old. I'm going to give kids under 25 the benefit of the doubt because their prefrontal cortex is still developing. But if you're over 25, you don't really have an excuse. You know, whether or not you've got a lot of trauma in your life or a lot of baggage, you can still take deep breaths and you can still step back and you can still help your kid regulate through co-regulation. Then you can reflect and then you can repair. And again, my suggestion is make sure you model for your kids apologizing or fixing mistakes so it becomes normal. And that's where you have to be vulnerable. And again, that's where ego comes into play, because you got to check your ego at the door to fix things, to repair things. You got to get your ego out of the way, and you've got to be okay that, yeah, I made a mistake. I wasn't the kindest person in that moment. I can be better. And that's the biggest thing that we need to do, is we need to realize when we're raising our kids or interacting with other adults that our emotions will get the best of us as well. You know, because the more irrational you are, the harder life is. Over the years, I learned that the more rational I was and the more I was able to check my ego at the door, the better relationships I had with parents and with kids. And even when I've suspended kids, like, it's funny because I've suspended so many kids over the years, and the kids who reach out to me the most right now as adults are kids that I suspended 4 or 5 times. You know, because I obviously handled it right, and they knew that I had respect for them, and they knew that we could fix whatever mistake they made, and that just because they were suspended didn't mean they were a person of poor character. They just made a mistake. You know, and I think to where I am now as a principal and as a father, I've had to grow through the lumps, you know, and here I am talking about emotional intelligence and social intelligence and providing as much information I can for you guys to be good parents. And I lost my shit 3 or 4 weeks ago. You know, I let my emotions get the best of me. And, you know, so we're human, it happens. So give yourself some grace and just work towards it. You need to have that growth mindset of being, you know, better at it, of taking a step back and being less emotional and being more rational. Okay? I hope this didn't come across as a lecture, but I just know that I've grown as a person in that regard too. You know, growing up Italians are fiery and emotional, so I'm not going to say it's harder for us Italians, but it's definitely in our blood. So on that note, you guys, peace out.